seminar. I'm Chris Monsieur, I'm a new faculty member in the Transportation Department. Transportation is the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department. Together with Dr. Robert T. and Dr. Jennifer Gill, we co-organized this seminar. And today we have David Ausherman from Fregonese, Calthorpe and Associates today to talk to us about land use implications for freight. Just a reminder, if you have your question, to make sure you press the button so that the people out on the web can hear us. So I'm going to have David will introduce a little bit about his background and what he does. So with that.
Thank you very much. My background is actually in landscape architecture. And I was just talking with a friend of mine yesterday saying, freight is just about as far away as you can get from landscape architecture. But so I practiced landscape architecture for about 10 years and then went into planning through Metro. And John Fregonese was the planning director at Metro and left to set up his practice and asked me to join him. So we've been out for about 6 years now and doing quite a lot of work around the country, including this year and last. We've been working with Chicago Metropolis 2020, looking at freight issues in the Chicago region, which has been actually quite a lot of fun. I thought I'd start out really looking at the national context of freight movement. This is the freight which moves through the country on trucks, so you can easily pick out the freeway system, the major arterial system. You can see Portland and Seattle up in the northwest, which are both very important freight centers. And you can see Chicago in the middle of the region. But really, Chicago shows up mostly on the rail movement. It's the one place in the country where all of the Class 1 railroads meet. It's the only place in the country where they all meet. They've sealed themselves as being the rail capital of North America. And at this point, they're really looking at ways that they can maintain that predominance on rail traffic, which they developed in the 19th century. But still, if you look at the volume of freight that's moved in the country, the majority is moved by truck. It was a shift that started in the 30s and 40s, mostly with freight moving from trains to trucks. And it's really continued to this day. And there's a little bit of shift back and forth between trains and trucks on certain commodities, depending on mostly on oil prices. If you look at the dollar value, again, the truck traffic is enormous. But you can actually see air freight, although the tonnage is quite low, the value is much more significant. And trying to think about the freight network and the land use implications, I developed a little graphic that sort of helped me think about it. As with every construct, it doesn't explain everything about the freight system or the freight movement system, but it kind of helped me think about it a little bit. If you start at the manufacturing side, there are quite a few products, agriculture, wood products, which are bulky and usually fairly heavy. Building materials, steel, a lot of commodities are manufactured or created and need to be shipped, as well as the high-tech industries in this area, which are mostly shipped by air. The second part of the equation is really what I call consolidation. It's where things are consolidated together to be shipped in bulk from one destination to another. It could either be a port, a water port, a seaport, a lake port, or an airport. But this is where loads are assembled and shipped. The third part is distribution, and this happens where you just break the loads. So if you have a ship coming in to Long Beach or an airplane coming in, a freight plane coming in, they basically just break out the loads and distribute them to often an intermediate position. It also happens with railroads at intermodal facilities where they shift loads from trains to trucks. and vice versa. The fourth part is storage, which is warehousing of various sorts. It's a place where goods are stored before they're actually retailed or distributed locally to local consumers. And the last piece of it is the delivery network. And I've divided it sort of into two pieces, which is the more large-scale construction industry, goods that are delivered to manufacturers, and big box retail kind of fits on that side because they require a lot of logistics. And on the smaller side, retail establishments, restaurants, grocery stores, down to the residential neighborhood, the individual residential consumer. So these are the main categories, and on the far side are really the land use portions of that. So you've got, in the manufacturing side, you have industrial land, agriculture, mineral extraction, at the consolidation, ports and airports, on distribution, intermodal yards, container yards, and just distribution facilities like a FedEx or a UPS facility. And then warehousing covers a really large group of land uses, from refrigerated to just large material yards. And the most variety is in the delivery network with retail establishments, restaurants. I mean, one of the things that I realized when we started working on this is that freight is everywhere. We can't walk outside of our building without seeing a FedEx truck or a UPS truck or somebody making a delivery to the restaurants. So the freight network really intersects completely with the local transportation network. And the thing about these land uses is that they have to be carefully located so that the freight doesn't overwhelm the local traffic and really increase congestion in a large way. So big box retail is typically located on freeway interchanges, which is probably a pretty appropriate place for it. You wouldn't want it downtown. But having said that, there's also a conflict with big box that will often move into industrial areas. They generate a tremendous amount of traffic from retail consumers and can really disrupt freight flows in the region. So just to illustrate some of these, the land uses and what they might look like, we just picked some things. This is all in the Chicago region. They have a fairly large pharmaceuticals business, which is the sort of high-tech end of things, where it's a very high-value product that's distributed usually by light van and air. Then there are the high-weight materials like building materials or any sort of mineral extraction. There's a lot of gravel quarrying there. That's usually moved by rail or by barge. And then the high-volume products, such as clothing, wood products, and agricultural products, are all consolidated in Chicago, mostly on the rail system. In the consolidation, this is actually Long Beach, which is not in Chicago. But the other part of it is airports. The portion of the airports that you usually see is where you check your bags and get onto your plane. But there are huge areas of airports that are set aside completely for freight. And they join into the distribution network and the warehousing network that's often associated with freight in the region. In Chicago, there is actually a fairly significant lake port. There's a lot of traffic, a lot of trade with Canada, primarily wood products. And there's a lot of barge traffic on the Chicago River and the Des Plaines River, largely for quarrying, gravel quarrying and moving goods, large, fairly low-value goods. And the third thing are intermodal facilities. And this is it's an interchange between trains and trucks, where they basically break a train and ship the goods locally by truck. And these have grown enormously. Now, intermodal facilities, they prefer to have at least a mile length and very strong connections with the local road system. As you can see here, they usually locate way out in the countryside. And they're beginning to replace a lot of the rail yards that are traditional in town. We have one here. I mean, Brooklyn Yard, you can actually drive, take the bridge over it. It's about 3,000 feet long, so it's a third of a mile long. They're wanting to replace that with a 1.5 mile long facility. These are fairly low employment areas per acre, anywhere from 4 to 6 employees an acre. They tend to go 24 hours, so you can increase the employment by adding shifts. But one of the phenomena that's really started driving this is is containerized shipping, where basically everything is put into a single container unit. It's shipped overseas in units, it's loaded off onto trains in units, or it's hooked up to trucks. And they're basically just containers that are very adaptable for moving goods. The distribution network is another one. These are both adjacent to O'Hare Airport in Chicago. So there are trains that come in. There's also a truck network. You can see how well connected they are with the freeway system, going directly through massive train yards, warehousing and other distribution facilities directly adjacent to them. But these in particular are more distribution than warehousing. It's a fine distinction. And then storage is the final piece. Most of our, yes?
What's the difference between the intermodal facilities and the distribution?
The intermodal facilities are typically located outside of the urban core. I mean, way outside, and they'll break a train and bring it into a distribution facility because the trains are, a couple of miles long, and since most of the local distribution yards are smaller, that's kind of how they address that. Otherwise, they'll just go straight through. If it's through traffic, then they'll go straight through. Okay. Storage facilities are again, really varied in terms of how they're used. I was in Barcelona over Christmas, and we took a train ride out, and there were all these cars stored on parking lots outside the city. I'm not sure that they were just-in-time deliveries, but they had no place to keep them in Barcelona, so they kind of moved them out. So there's some land-extensive things like storing cars and trucks. Just-in-time delivery for appliances. If you go to a retail appliance store, they're going to have display items. If you want one, they'll bring it from a warehouse off-site and either bring it to you that day or deliver it to your house. And bulk construction materials like wood and bricks and things. Often the yards won't have them on hand. They'll have them in storage facilities outside. And then warehousing. In some cases, like the Meyer and Frank, they basically have their storage, or a good part of their storage, on site, but they also have a lot of deliveries that come in from off-site locations. If you go across the Burnside Bridge, you'll see all the fruit warehouses that deliver fresh fruit and vegetables to grocery stores in town. But I mean, it just kind of it's this sort of sequence of events where the retail establishment will have what they can sell in a short period of time. The warehouses will carry the bulk of those goods. And the distribution facilities are constantly renewing the supplies. I mean, to think about the freight network, it really is the lifeblood of a civilization. It's constantly moving. And it makes use of various land uses on its way. And I just showed a couple of examples on the delivery side. Big box retail, which we all know and love, but also on a community scale, anything from a small shopping center, which this is, down to a corner store, will all drive freight and freight deliveries. The next piece I wanted to focus in is really just talking more about the state of Illinois and Chicago itself. This is a forecast of freight, of truck, the number of trucks per day on the road system. This is 1998, 2020. So you can see there's a huge number of trucks that share the roads. And one thing we found in Chicago is that if this forecast is true, it will completely overwhelm the auto traffic. What we're anticipating is an increase in auto traffic in the region. This is the national picture of Illinois. This is the freight movement by train. So you can really see it sits right in the center of the country, and virtually everything goes through Chicago. And this is its position in the truck movement. If you look at freight by volume, you can really see how, and this is just the Illinois part of it, trucks are still far and away the dominant. But rail is actually a bigger component in the Illinois area than it is nationally. And if you look at the dollar value, I mean, this is really a little bit daunting in a way, because air freight in terms of volume is flat, absolutely flat. I mean, it's going to triple, but it still doesn't show up. But when you look at it in terms of the dollar value, it tells you, since it's high-value materials, that they're going to be largely shipped out by vans. It's going to, a lot of this is, the Amazon.com phenomenon, where you can get something delivered to your door, and there's a van going to come down your driveway to give it to you. But this was, I thought, one of the most interesting parts of it is if you look at the proportion nationally of truck to rail, it's about 15% rail and 85% truck. But in Illinois, it's about 60% rail traffic, and this is by volume. And if you look at the at the forecast, Illinois is actually going to lose a little bit of its rail proportion, but the increase in air freight is really phenomenal. I was talking with Ariane on the way over, and I'm not sure if it's that O'Hare is just such a central location that it sort of dominates in air freight. But the dollar value of the air freight is going to increase significantly there, which again I think has as big an impact on the roads as a lot of other semi trucks. And the real focus of the rest of the presentation is just about Chicago, which is where we know the most, or where we have the best data. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the plan of Chicago, Daniel Burnham's plan, but there's a whole chapter devoted to freight mobility, which was a big problem then, and they actually set about to see what they could do to solve it. His idea was, at the time, I mean, the reason, how many of you have been to Chicago? I mean, you know how tiny the loop is geographically. It's just and the reason for that is really it was completely surrounded by freight functions along the river, and the railroads all came into the city. His idea at that time was to try and get the railroads to move out away from the city, so that there would be a loop outside. And his strategy was really to just extend, allow the loop to grow, to allow the central city to grow by moving freight outward from the central city. And it didn't go anywhere because he proposed, these shared yards that the railroads found completely unacceptable. But ironically, over the last several years, the railroads themselves realized the problems that they were having, and made an agreement to develop what they call the CREATE program. It's by the American Association of Railroads. And what they created is a system that's all of the colored lines that you see are shared lines among all the railroads. So instead of having their own private roads or their own private rail lines, any railroads can use those for free. So it's not even a toll road. And they've developed a system that allows for triple redundancy. so that if one line is blocked for any reason at all, there are two other lines that are open. A lot of this came out of a really devastating snowstorm that happened in the 60s. And since then, they actually have been working to try and develop a plan that would keep that from happening again, because it really, since so much rail freight goes through Chicago, it really shut down freight nationally. Their concern, or one concern, is that essentially what was happening, it took longer, or it took as long to get freight from Los Angeles to Chicago as it did to get freight across the city of Chicago, which is not a very good statistic, not something you want to build a business on. So they've been working closely with this. It seems to be moving in the right direction. These are the components of it. I'm not the person to really discuss that plan specifically. The second thing that's been going on, which is the land use side of it, is the city of Chicago has been working on an industrial corridors program where they're identifying critical industrial lands that are within the city and doing a similar thing to what we've done here, which is industrial sanctuaries, kind of disallowing conflicting uses, trying to maintain industrial uses into the future. These are so far, and they're taking the industrial corridor program, and they're actually going one step further to planned manufacturing, what they call planned manufacturing districts. And these really do lock in the land uses over time. They put enormous restrictions on the allowable uses that are there. So one of the criteria for industrial corridors and planned manufacturing districts is the accessibility to expressways, to rail, arterials, and but that's the primary criteria that they've been using. They're looking for sort of consolidated or large contiguous areas of industrial land, but what they're trying to do is to maintain all the options open. There's a preference to buy rail-served land, even if the current owner doesn't use the rail. Having that option maintains the value. So that was the primary criterion that they used to identify them. But within those, there's a lot of different kinds of uses. They have reports on each of the industrial corridors. And one of the things we noticed in looking through those is that the uses tend to cluster. So you'll get a lot of food processing companies that will be in one contiguous area. Our speculation is that it's because deliveries are just made simple, much more simple. One truck can come and deliver to several different facilities. There are no industrial corridors currently outside of the city of Chicago, and that's actually our project this year, is to identify industrial lands outside that should be protected outside of the city of Chicago. Because here, you essentially have, this is an industrial corridor. It's also the city limit. And so the land directly on the other side of the road is not protected just because it's not in the same jurisdiction, which functionally makes no sense. Just to give a sense of the kinds of criteria that we're looking for, and we're developing these as we go to kind of look at what criteria would you apply if you were going to identify industrial corridors elsewhere that you would want to protect from incursion of other uses. And what we've come up with is the basic, rail access, expressway access, and one of the other issues that has come up in Chicago is really transit access, trying to give get workers to their jobs using transit wherever that's possible, particularly within the city, and also keeping them onto designated truck routes so that you're not running a lot of trucks through neighborhoods, so that they'll be better neighbors. We also looked at one industrial corridor to just kind of look at the reasons that you want to go through a program like this is to protect it from changes over time. I mean, you see it happening a lot. In Chicago, there are about 165 municipalities, and about six of them have full-time mayors. So, and what you'll get is, even wards will have some land use decision-making or abilities, and sometimes things will happen within a traditional industrial corridor, like a shopping mall or commercial development, that will cause conflicts along a rail line. And as well, there's adjacent residential development, commercial development displacing industrial land. And what happened in this case is that this rail line was abandoned in the last 10 years, just because they lost their customer base, and there were so many conflicts created by other uses that it didn't make sense to keep it. So these are the sort of problems that you can run into with industrial land. I know there was a proposal here for, I can't remember if it was Walmart, but they wanted to locate in the Northwest Industrial Area. Land is cheap, the access is good, and they were turned down. And these are the reasons why, because it can really erode the viability of an industrial zone. Another component of the plan that we'd like to look at is abandoned rail lines. At this point, there's no policy in terms of what to do if a railroad abandons, and often they're fragmented. They're dedicated back to adjacent land owners, and we sort of feel like they should be studied on a case-by-case basis, but essentially to have first right of refusal to maintain it. There are a lot of uses that they could be put to in terms of extending transit access. Even pedestrian rights, pedestrian walkways. There's currently one under planning in Chicago. But in the face of the industrial, one of the other aspects of the industrial corridors program is what to do with isolated industrial land, smaller parcels of land that are left over, that are not included in the corridors program. And in this case, basically a huge rail yard that's being all abandoned. So the red lines are the ones that are being abandoned. And in this case, most of the land is just south of the loop, so it's very accessible to the city. It's an enormous piece of newly vacant land or recycled land that could come into new uses, and there are quite a few ways that they could be developed. I mean, in this case, you've got some properties that have high visibility from the expressway system. You have land along the river where they're actually looking at putting in mixed-use housing and retail. And then there are little bits and pieces, and these are all over the place where you've got just one or two buildings that are pretty far from the industrial core that could be redeveloped and reintegrated into the surrounding neighborhoods.
Your idea. So your idea is that parcels that are not within these protected industrial corridors should be redeveloped?
No, they should be they should be studied for their potential. But I mean, if they're viable industrial uses then they should be maintained. I don't think there should be, except in some focused areas. This abandoned rail yard is really similar to the Pearl district that's going on now. So I mean, that's just an area of urban expansion that you should take advantage of. I mean, and which they are taking advantage of. The isolated pieces, it's a good question. I just think they should be, they aren't a part of the core industrial lands, and in some cases, they are underutilized. They could be declining, manufacturing. They could be abandoned, but I think they should be studied on a case-by-case basis. But it does open up some potential for new urban uses. Our goal in this project is really to look to the future of freight needs in the region. As I said, this year our focus is really looking outside the city of Chicago at the six-county region to see if there are suburban freight needs. One of the things one of our resources is existing land use throughout the region, and we can bring this to bear, sort of looking at what lands are immediately adjacent to railroads and other methods of analysis. But what we did, and this is a sort of a GIS analysis, a pretty straight up analysis, but there are about 105,000 acres of industrial land in the region based on the 1995 land use. So we first looked at Class 1 railroads. There are quite a few that come through the region. And we really just looked at those that are immediately adjacent, because being close to a railroad doesn't help you. You really need to have the adjacency there. And that's about half the land is adjacent. And then we looked at what land is close to expressways or freeway exits. And what we did there was to develop a cost surface that looks at different classes of roads. It allows quick travel along expressways, somewhat slower travel along arterials, and there's a lot of impedance on local streets. And that gives you this kind of web of where the further you get away from a main road, the less distance you can cover. This is sort of cost. The cost is really the impedance along the road system, and we use that to select the land within 5 miles of an expressway, and then basically cut that down to about 2.5 miles from an expressway. So these are lands that are really have very good highway access. And then we did a similar thing with the truck routes in the region, using a cost surface, so that lands that are very close to truck routes were given preference over ones that are further away. And these are the lands that were identified through that. So we and we scale it back so that it was just a half a mile. So you're really almost there. And then we looked at existing intermodal facilities. These are really the small distribution yards that exist in Chicago. Most of the true intermodal facilities, or the modern intermodal facilities, are well outside the region. And this is the land that was close to the existing yards. So we used a combination of those factors to identify about a third of the total industrial land in the region as appearing to have the accessibility criteria, or meeting the accessibility criteria that we set up. And then we kind of narrowed that down to make it even. We're looking for the unfungible lands in the region, the lands that you can't replace easily, and particularly because of rail, because rail is such a fixed transportation means. So we were looking for the sort of hard knuckle of freight land in the region. And critical industrial protection zones. And there were about 20,000 acres, so a fifth of the land, of the industrial land in the region. And then we expanded that so that the support lands, the kind of industrial lands that support the core, through their adjacency, and added those back in. And then we looked at vacant land within, that is contiguous with that. And this is land that could be added, and particularly when you get out into the more suburban areas, which are currently developing at a fairly rapid rate. You want to get ahead of it because given the kind of lax land use regulations that they have in Illinois, a lot of those can be converted to subdivisions quite easily and build in a conflict for any industrial expansion. And then last, we looked at the corridors around Class 1 railroad facilities, or Class 1 railroads, looking for some potential sites for intermodal facilities where you can find 1.5 miles of track frontage and at least 600 to 800 acres of land. So this really shows it's essentially half of the land, half of the industrial land in the region that we decided to focus in on and do some more study in terms of how, whether it might be protected or not. And out of those lands, we really looked at clusters of industrial land, so fairly large lumps of contiguous land, and decided to take that to the next stage of development. So just as an example, we looked at the industrial lands around O'Hare Airport. And in fact, the city of Chicago has a cherry stem that includes O'Hare Airport, but none of the land to the east or to the west of O'Hare is inside the city of Chicago. So they don't have any control over it. Part of it's in Lake County, part of it's in suburban Cook County, and it's also in a number of different municipalities, within their city limits. So it's pretty important that they considered this. I mean, one of the issues with when you think about the accessibility criteria that we used, it's the similar criteria that a shopping mall would look for, except for the rail. They want to be near a freeway access. They want to have that visibility. So there is a lot of competition for accessible land, and particularly in suburban areas where larger parcels are available, and industrial land is cheap. It can really raise some important or some problematic conflicts. So it seemed, this has an open space buffer on the east side. It does have access from Metra. The Metra line runs along the south of it, so there are a couple of points, say 3 or 4 points, where you could get, and if you consider this rail yard here, there are quite a few ways to get workers to the site using public transit. And so we just drew a boundary around it, and we'll take that to the next level of study this year. The second piece of work that we looked at was an intermodal facility, and these are the 5 Class 1 railroads that don't currently have an intermodal facility outside of the region. So we try to identify some sites that would meet the criteria that were set out, which is basically 1 mile of track frontage and at least 600 acres of contiguous land. And also use the accessibility to expressways, because it's a rail truck interface, so you want to be able to get from the trucks back on the expressway system. And then these are the pieces of land that looked like they had some potential. Just as when you think about it, out of all the land in Chicago, that's all the land that met the criteria, and it was very surprising to us. And then out of those, we chose one site to study in more detail. In this case, we had the Class 1 rail line coming in from the south and the expressway immediately adjacent. This is south of where there's currently a plan for a new south suburban airport. And then we looked at the vacant land that was adjacent. There were several parcels that met the general criteria. So these are sections of land, so that's 500-acre parcel, 600-acre parcel, each one with at least a mile of track frontage. And out of those, we just sort of picked the one that seemed like it made the most sense. It had direct access to the freeway. It met the length criteria, and it met the more or less met the area criteria. So thanks very much. That's. Yes. Oh, okay.
I have a question from a viewer in Minnesota. I think you may have actually addressed what he was interested in. Just bear with me a moment. So he's sort of explaining what he's working on, and he says, we're experiencing early growth in close proximity to our freight facilities, specifically rail terminals and water ports that may lead to the inability to expand those facilities when needed. As part of developing a statewide freight plan, we're beginning to develop performance measures or indicators for plans surrounding facilities, both to serve as a buffer for compatibility with the neighborhood and to provide for future freight facility expansion. So he's wondering if you are aware of any national experience with protecting land around freight facilities and whether there are state DOT type initiatives that are looking at this. In Minnesota, they're trying to look at ways in which the state can plan for freight facility expansion in the future.
Wow. I wish I did know. No, I think the reason we're involved with Chicago Metropolis is to try and get ahead of that curve, because if you look at the development patterns, I think the intermodal analysis is probably the most telling, where an awful lot of those lands are already encroached by subdivisions and conflicting land uses. So the further ahead you can get, and I think developing the criteria as we've done, where you can identify the land that has the accessibility that you need and the land extensive characteristics that you need is critical to planning for the future of freight. But I'm not aware of. There are more plans out there to try and fix problems that have already happened than there are to get ahead of the curve. Yes.
With a lot of these situations where you have these industrial corridors, and you have, like you're mentioning, this suburban encroachment or just residential encroachment that's happened maybe on both sides of the corridor.
Mm-hmm.
When you're looking into the planning of these corridors, do you take into account the fact that you might need some roads to kind of transect, to maybe to keep the circulation okay for passenger vehicle usage, like maybe from one residential area through to another, so you're not kind of creating a dead zone where the people have to go, make real circuitous routes to get where they want to get?
Yeah, it's something that that came up that we're looking at the residential industrial interface.
Mm-hmm.
How can you make that friendlier? Because they're very different textures. But sometimes, a well-designed street can serve both purposes, and you can even have, sort of wholesale, shop fronts that would face onto the street. So, I think you can keep the connectivity. You don't want to block off an industrial area. You just want to restrict what roads they have access to. You really do want it to be a part of the network. You just want it to not have to go along residential streets to get to.
Right, and I'm thinking on the other side too, where for residents to be able to kind of drive through an industrial area.
Right.
So not looking at a street going through an industrial area for any kind of development purposes or having shops on it or anything like that. Just from the standpoint of let's make sure when we've got these industrial corridors that we don't lock a lot of people out from being able to just drive through and get to another destination that's located.
No, that's true. But you don't have the same density of streets in an industrial area that you do in a residential neighborhood. So you're going to have an arterial that goes through the industrial area. Whereas when you get into a neighborhood situation, you're going to have a lot of local streets. So no, the intention is really not to block things off. It's to keep the connectivity. But we were just thinking about because sometimes you'll have one street a street, and on one side will be residential, and the other side will be industrial. And in that case, I think a good street design, can make them happier together. But no, that's a good point, actually. Yes.
Some of those places that you look at already have roads going through them, just not as densely as.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, if you, it probably is the same kind of. It's a similar street density, but they're wider. I mean, they're industrial streets. They're not residential streets. So I mean, you'll still have the same connectivity, but the focus is really to get trucks to the arterials network and onto the freeway system, onto the long distance.
I don't know if you've covered it, but is there any examination of what sort of effects that these rail lines might have? I'm thinking, for instance, in terms of noise pollution or other things like that, what effects the topography and things like that might have on these?
On the industrial corridors, on the rail yards?
On the rail yards,
Yeah.
and the relationship to residential areas and commercial areas, yes.
I think this slide tells you a lot because there's a lot of grade separation, but you lift a train up in the air and it makes a bit of noise. But I would rather have that than a freeway up there, which is more constant. So there's noise pollution, but I don't think it's any greater than any other urban use in a sense. Yes.
I'm curious what exactly the mechanism would be for protecting.
Well,
Just zoning, and then also you mentioned there's 160-odd jurisdictions
right.
in the area and how you deal with that.
That's our challenge, really, is to come up with a set of guidelines that are going to be acceptable. That are, basically, it's in their economic interest to protect the land. But I think what we're going to try to do is develop model ordinances. So you would restrict big box retail. That's a definite. And then beyond, how far you could go down to in your restrictions really depends on what kind of an agreement you could cut between the jurisdictions. But it's really more functional. You want to maintain the functionality of the industrial area, and so what policies need to be put in place to do that. You don't want speed bumps on your on your truck routes. I mean, but no, that's our work this year, is really to look at the policies. I mean, we've identified the lands we think that meet the criteria, and so now it's really trying to hash out how to protect it.
Actually, several more questions from web viewers.
Okay.
The first one has to do with the question about what's a distribution facility versus what's an intermodal facility. So is the Rivergate district, the port calls it intermodal, so the question was, is that in fact, you view that as intermodal?
Yeah, it's a kind of a gray area to me as well. They were things that, I've sort of built the construct, and it seemed to me that there were certain areas that are really just about breaking large loads into smaller loads, which an intermodal facility does. But in another sense, depending on where you are, an intermodal facility is just like a port. So, I would say here, Rivergate, because you're taking freight from ships and from trains and loading them onto trucks is probably more of an intermodal facility. But they're all distribution facilities. It's just kind of because freight is a continuous moving network. It's kind of hard to say. This starts here and this stops here. So.
There's another question. I'll just read it. So wineries are not aging their wine in barrels anymore. They're aging in bottles. So the winery bottles of wine, ships it to a warehouse, provided time before and the warehouse is distributed. So this is transferring storage from the vineyard location to the warehouse location.
Mm-hmm.
And that question was increasing. technology. Well, do you just want to comment on that phenomenon in general that it's consistent in other industries as well, where especially you're trying to foist warehousing onto others? And does that impact your experience in Chicago?
Well, there are a lot of vineyards in Chicago, but no. I mean, there's a similar phenomenon, where in the ag industry, for instance, it used to be that trains would go and pick up directly from silos. Efficient for them to deal with goods. So, no, I mean, I think there's a lot of movement of where things are stored, and how they're. It's constantly fluctuating. But I mean, in a sense, if you think about it, is the farmland more valuable for growing grapes and making wine, or is it more valuable for storing, casks of aging wine? So, it's not a terrible trade-off.
As far as the construction of these intermodal yards, is the land under single ownership, or are the railroads going to need some sort of governmental assistance in assembling the land, consolidating it?
There's the Joliet Arsenal, which is to the south of the Chicago region. The government helped assemble that land. The railroad has paid for all of the development. Railroads are a very capital-intensive industry, and they usually build their own stuff and own it themselves. That's why the AAR plan, the CREATE plan, is so unusual, that they actually got together and decided to share facilities for the good of all, because usually they're very competitive with one another. Having said that, they will go out and buy land themselves and develop it themselves. I mean, they don't require government assistance. The Joliet Arsenal was a case where the city wanted to intervene for a lot of reasons. They wanted to create jobs within the region. They had the land, and the railroads were interested in that. So I think there's some private partnerships, but the railroads will usually do their own stuff themselves.
Criteria are used to decide with like an abandoned rail line whether it should be used for freight or transit or a bike ped trail? What goes into that?
Boy, I mean, our preference would always be to turn it into some kind of transit, if possible. It might open up, if there's a rail yard attached to it that might include some redevelopment or some urban type of development, then that seems to make the most sense. In some cases, though, I mean, a pedestrian trail just is the most appropriate use, and it depends. I mean, if it's a line that doesn't go anywhere, I mean, that would support transit, then that's going to help limit. I mean, that's going to help make your decision for you. If there's, if in fact it has been the cause of some, sometimes railroads, because they don't like to have roads cross them. Will really create a break, will divide neighborhoods from each other. So it could be that would be a way of connecting things back together. So I think it's case by case. But our preference would be, transit, some kind of other transportation facility, and open space, kind of in that order.
She may or may not know anything about this, but it came to my attention recently, I guess, with the whole increase in containerization and the trade imbalance, that apparently there's a big imbalance of actual empty containers.
Yeah.
And they're shipping stuff from China, and the containers come here when you buy all the products out of them, and then they're just empty and they're here. And it's more economical to build a new one in China and ship it than to ship the empty ones back. And did you come across that? Because that's a huge amount of empty containers that have to be stored someplace.
Yes.
There must be some implication of that kind of land use.
Yes. In fact, it's really, really unpopular there are container yards in Chicago, and people are it's the highest thing on the landscape, with Chicago being so flat. And some of the people there are saying, that the best thing they think you could do is to just chop them up, fill a container with, scrap metal, and send it back to China. Because there's an enormous trade imbalance that doesn't seem to go away. I mean, the other thing you see them used now as storage facilities. They're selling containers to individuals to.
Well, I actually saw some of our students were working on a project in the Seattle area near Bowman Field, and they came across some architects in Britain who had used them to create modular housing that was actually quite attractive. I mean, the way that they used them and put them together and you come up with a whole way, you got the kitchen unit and the living room unit. It looked a lot better. I mean, you sort of have to see the pictures because I was amazed about it.
Well, there we go. Affordable housing. We can solve.
It was a lot cheaper. I mean,
Yeah.
construction was darn cheap.
I'd love to see that actually. Okay.
I think if you go, this was a competition, a real estate competition that we had a student team enter, and they put together, their project is on the School of Urban Studies Planning website under the student project. There's a link to the PDF, and I don't know if in their project there's a picture of that. I just saw them give a presentation of it. But, I was quite fascinated by it and the potential for it.
I think it's a great idea. Terrific. Yes.
Has there been any interest in Chicago to look at our metro, how it covers abroad, municipalities, and kind of get them on a goal plan for the Chicago area to kind of get everybody coordinated?
Yes. Right now, there's a regional COG, NIPSI, Northeast Illinois Planning Commission, and then there's a separate Transportation Authority, which is CATS, and so they're not even in the same building together. And like Metro is both the MPO and the Regional Planning Agency. So there's currently an effort to get those two put together. Chicago Metropolis is interested in having a regional authority with some teeth, but they just don't think they can, get there. Metro was, the timing of Metro was really fortuitous. A lot of places would like to get there, but having said that, you can do quite a lot through just cooperation, through finding regional values that people share and work from the positive down rather than having absolute authority over land use planning, which Metro essentially does have if they want to use it. So yeah, there's some interest, but it seems doubtful, at least in their opinion.
There's one other question from the web.
Mm-hmm.
Are there materials or will there be a report available eventually for this work?
Yes, Chicago Metropolis 2020.org has a lot of previous documents posted, and they'll definitely be posting something on this. They have there's a current report called Critical Cargo, which was it came out about 3 years ago, which is available on their website. And then what we're doing is continuing that effort.
I just had a quick plug for us. Dr. Bertini and I are co-teaching a freight class this quarter, so if you're interested in this, we'll be offering it again in the winter quarter. So.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.